Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode 29. When did that happen? And it's called I Contain Multitudes, Win Rates and Copy Numbers. So, I Contain Multitudes is, of course, a Bob Dylan song, but it's also a very good book about microbial communities inside you by Ed Yong, and I highly recommend it if you are interested in bacteria inside you in this sort of accessible level to read it. But today, the multitudes will be cards in your deck. And the episode is all about card categories based on optimal copy numbers for a card in your deck based on win rates from 17 lands. So we're going to look at the cards that are good independently of how many you put in your deck. We're going to look at cards that are quite specific in terms of like, you probably only want to have one copy of that in your deck and more of them are actually detrimental. We're going to look at interesting cards that are actually you can have 3 copies of them, but fourth is pushing it, and we're going to try to figure out why. So the idea comes from the fact that I talked on limited resources about 5 copies of Imperial Oath, and that it has actually higher win rate than any other number of copies of Imperial Oath. And I thought, well, why won't we look at all the other cards? And this is not to solve Kamigawa, because I think that, you know, we're deep in the format. Maybe it's not super interesting to get a very topic very specific to the set, but from this kind of analysis we can look at what do those cards that are good in multitudes or good as a one-off have in common, and maybe try to figure out how we can incorporate those ideas into our card evaluation and deck building skills for the future sets. Because even though this is all guidelines and it's not like strict science, there's definitely some common features of particular categories of the cards that will be interesting. And then later we're going to dive deeper into the card that I selected. So Mystical Dispute, another good podcast that I recommend you add to your listening schedule from G-Guards and 2.Cubed. They asked the question, which card in this format do you like playing even though the win rate is not high? And my answer was Okiba Salvage. And I thought, okay, card doesn't have a very good win rate, but maybe people play it badly. Maybe people play it in the wrong decks. So I decided to dive a bit deeper into the data related to the card and just like take a quick peek. And we're gonna have a couple of slides to summarize my findings. Right. So without further ado, I always start with a preamble, and that's my 5-minute soapbox moment, so I can warm up for the podcast and or for the stream and get into the mood. And it's usually topics related to the presentation or to something that recently happened on Magic Twitter, because why not? And today I wanted to talk about cheating. There was this nice thread, I don't remember even by who, but it started with one thing and then it sort of evolved into this big thread about cheating in Magic in general and how it was about the bot that would be perfect Magic player. What kind of win rate would it have? And then someone said that a guy in their LGS has 100% win rate, but they have a weirdly marked sleeves every time. And I thought about it because, I started playing Magic at Weatherlight, so what was it, 97 maybe? And I was really competitive, like between 2000 and 2004. That was the time that I was playing like GPs and qualified for a pro tour and nationals every year, whatever. So I played a lot, and that was also the time when I think that cheating was pretty much rampant. I do remember people describing when they printed fetchlands. I heard people describing them as a better vampiric tutor because it lets you get the land, fix your mana draws, and then you pay 1 life and you put the card that you need to draw on top of your library, because it was obvious for them that they will try to stack their library. It was awful. Like, if you played in those times, you had to focus more on seeing what the opponent is doing with their hands than what the battlefield is presenting. And it was a painful thing to play. And still, you didn't catch everything, that you were cheated. I vividly remember going to GPs. I was always playing side events, and I only played foreign language booster drafts, because if you played it in foreign language, the chance of someone putting in cards into their deck that they didn't draft but they had in their binder was a bit smaller, because maybe they didn't have Korean version of a particular busted rare. And it removes so much pleasure from the game because, I play Magic because I want to play Magic. I'm interested in the intellectual challenge. If I was interested in a game that promotes manual skill of stacking library or manual skill of sleight of hand, I would maybe pick the game that is, specifically focusing on that particular skill set. And cheating hurts because for everyone that wins a game because of cheating, they are cutting someone out that played fair and square. And everyone that makes a top 8 by cheating sort of kicks out a person that didn't cheat from that top 8. And if cheating is so rampant, as I said, it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, lots of people probably got disappointed with the game at the competitive level because, because they were cheated out of so many successes that they could have had. And then there was a discussion about it, and I thought, why don't we have mechanisms to try to detect it? And one thing I suggested was, if we have a large chunk of tournaments online and a large chunk of tournaments in paper in the future, when paper thing is going to be fully back. And, I'm not talking about your FNMs or the local shop tournament series or something. I'm talking Pro Tour GP and their equivalents online. There are ways of trying to figure out mechanisms to detect cheating. And I'm not saying to detect cheating and tag someone as a cheater, but at least to flag someone as a potential cheater. Obviously, in the online game, there is no way of cheating, which is great. That's why I returned and I love the game more than ever, because I know that whatever I win, whatever I lose, it's based on my skill and my ability, and not on my inability to see someone stacking my deck, which is great. In this way, I'm quite the opposite of the people that complain about shuffler. I love the shuffler because it creates those random hands that are just random and not stacked. If you have a large enough sample size of a professional level player playing online and in paper, and somehow you see that they are way, way better in paper than they are online, that would be a strange result for me. And that could be something that might raise flags. Look, this person just can't seem to lose anything in paper, but then they are mediocre online. Let's maybe look at some older feature match coverage or things like that, and see, hire someone that specializes in fraud detection and see if there was something fishy going on in there. I'm not saying that you should ban a player just based on the difference in win rate, but flagging is not a terrible thing if it can detect fraud. And you will say it's brutal, but there are mechanisms like that employed in the real world. So one problem with doctors is that doctors can as easily cure someone as they can kill someone. And there's been plenty of cases where there were serial killers that were doctors because they got away with it. They were killing their patients. And I think somewhere in the 90s or maybe early 2000s, the British health system, they basically started tracking that. They were starting to track doctors that have a suspiciously high death rate of their patients. And they did catch a serial killer based on that, because it flagged in their system, and they did some extra tests, and they figured out that the doctor was actually killing his patients, poisoning them or euthanizing them while he was treating them, without actual permission from that patient. They also found a doctor that was sort of a vigilante, euthanizing patients because they wanted to. That was maybe not something that they would want to detect. And weirdly, they also found one doctor that was suspicious, and then they realized that basically his general practice was in an area where there were so many elderly people that his death rates were higher just because his patients were way higher than the average would be. So not a perfect system. So you can't, based on that system, say, okay, this is a serial killer, but you can flag those doctors and do some extra deep checking because the numbers are just fishy. And I think that kind of system, if applied neatly, nicely, cleanly, and without starting witch hunts for no reason, could be beneficial. Because if we can root out one cheater, two cheaters using that kind of system from the game, I think that the game as a totality will gain. And that's my preamble about cheating. So let's forget about it, or remember about it, keep that in mind, but let's focus on today's topic. And as I said, the topic is copy numbers of cards. And there will be plenty of types of cards. And we know some slang from the Magic content creation. You have the one-offs, cards that you only want to have one of in your deck. You have collectibles, cards that are not good on their own, but if you have like 5-6, they can all of a sudden become really good. And I think a recent example of such a card was Shipwreck Sifter, which one Shipwreck Sifter was not probably making your deck much better, but if you have 4 or 5 of them, all of a sudden they became a real threat and danger. And there is of course a whole world in between, and I will try to at least give you an overview of what that might encompass. So it's very context dependent, and it will vary from set to set. In some sets, a card like Shock will be maybe not so very playable. In some decks, it will be like any number of Shocks will be great, depending on how fast the format is, how much you need to deal with early threats, and how efficient you need to be with that, and so on. So it will be set specific, and it will be not universal for every set. So even the same card can be in a different category for different sets. So in order to try to figure it out, I looked at win rates of decks with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 copies of each card that I'm looking at per deck. And this is based on the 17 Lands public data. You have to keep in mind that optimal number of copies of the card, so the one that has the highest win rate, will not be optimal necessarily for your deck, because your deck might be a special case and you have to always think about it. It's a general number that will give you a good idea of certain things. And I also made a limiting factor, so at least 100 games are needed in each category to qualify. So it means that if I have a card that has 90 games with 5 copies in a deck, I didn't look at it. I treated it as a non-existing data. But if there was 101 games with 5 copies in a deck of a particular card, that already qualified. You have to make the cutoff somewhere, and this cutoff is not perfect because I would rather have larger sample sizes, but otherwise I would have a much smaller data set. So I decided to go for a larger data set in terms of numbers of cards and copies that I have, and accept the fact that it's not a perfect one and that there is an error rate in the inherent error rate in the limitations I applied to my data set. Sometimes you have to balance between large sample size or lots of data, and in this case, because it's a sort of high throughput analysis, I went for the larger data size. It's larger by 100. It was easier for me to write, but I don't think that there was a single card that was there was a question in the chat if it was bigger than 99 or bigger than 100. I don't think that there was a single case where it mattered really. So but it's larger than 100. It has to be 101. Okay, so first of all, a category of data I will not really look into at all are the cards where I only found decks with 1 copy, and I didn't find decks with 2, 3, 4, 5. And there was plenty of those cards, so it's not that they don't exist. And it's mainly rares, mythics, and cards that are just unplayable, so people play them rarely, and even if they do, they play 1 copy. And there will be cards like that. I mean, there's rares and mythics. Not every rare you'll be lucky to play like hundreds of games with 2 of them. But usually really good rares, you will find them because people really want to have them. And especially really good and undervalued rares are going to have decks that have 2 copies of them. So we have the cards with maximum 1 copy in the data, which we don't talk about. Now, I'm going to talk now about the cards that have 2 copies maximum in the deck in the data pool. So it means that there are decks with 1 copy and decks with a 2 copy. It's usually decreasing. So There will be more decks with 1 copy, fewer decks with 2 copies, even fewer with 3, even fewer with 4, and even fewer with 5. And first I wanted to look at the improving cards, which means that a 1 copy has a win rate of X, and a deck with 2 copies has a higher win rate. And I wanted to look at the cards that improve the most when you put this second copy in your deck. And the interesting part is that March of the Reckless Joy is the winner. That's the red March, the one that makes this sort of weird version of, what was the card from Crimson Vow? Reckless Insight. So you basically exile X cards from the top of your library and you can play them until your next turn. And it's strange for me. I can't explain why cards with multiples were so much better. The decks with 2 copies were so much better than decks with 1 copy. Decks with 1 copy were not particularly good, and I think that it might be something that people played it because it was a rare very often, and maybe with people that drafted 2 of them, they sort of had a plan related to that card. So maybe that's the reason. Second card on the list, and oh yeah, March of Reckless Joy has a 9 percentage points higher win rate when you have 2 copies than when you have 1 copy of it. That's quite a big boost. Second card that was there was Lightpost Emperor's Voice. And actually, the decks with 1 copy had a very mediocre win rate, but decks with 2 copies had a pretty decent win rate. It was like around 60%, I think. So really solid win rate for a games played win rate in this format, which makes me think that the first copy was picked very early. A person that was building it really went for the aura synergies, and on top of that, they probably also got the second copy to sort of make the deck consistent as a build around, because if you have 2 copies, you will draw your deck engine much more frequently, and that will lead to blowouts when you can play multiple of those auras. And it's the same with Ishin 2 Heavens as 1. That's the attack trigger doubler Mardu card, and it has the kind of same build around aspect to it. And third, and that's the Light was at 8 percentage point increase, and Ishin had 7.1 percentage point increase. So these are all sort of cards that are sort of build around. And the fourth one is Kyodai, Soul of Kamigawa, which is technically not a build around, but it's a card that can be sort of built around you when you build it in a 5-color deck. So I think that maybe if you have 2 copies, you're more likely to try to go for the sort of Wooburg synergies to try to get that extra ability. So Kyodai gives indestructible to a creature. It has 3/3 and flash, 3/3 flyer with flash, but it also has Wooburg, give it +5/+5 until end of turn, which is definitely a powerful ability if you can trigger it. And maybe with 1 it's not worth it, but maybe with 2 of them in the deck, people try to do it as a sort of build around. Also, interestingly, 3 of the 4 cards are legends, which you think that legends in multiples will not be better, but these ones, because they're also build arounds in the way, maybe are an exception to that rule. Then we have collection of powerful cards. We have at the same level as Kyodai, we have Kami of Vengeance. Obviously, having multiple copies of that will be great. Fable of the Mirror Breaker, that card is busted already in the first place, and having 2 of them is even more busted. So yes, I can imagine why that was going to happen. Thundering Raiju, again, same thing. And we have Anchor to Reality. That's the Tinker effect for vehicles and equipments. Having 2 copies increases the win rate by 4.2 percentage points. But you have to keep in mind that the win rate of 1 copy was pretty low. So it increases it from a very low level to a slightly higher level, but I guess that this is another effect of the build arounds are better when you have multiple copies of the pivotal card for the build around. And then we have Anchor to Reality, the Dragon Kami Reborn. I guess that it's just slightly better because it's not so good in the first place. Aki Warpaint, same case. That was pretty poor on its own, and it's slightly better when you have multiple copies. March of the Wretched Sorrow, which is just a good card. So I guess having a couple of copies is great because you can raise any deck because of the life gain of it and removing the creature. And then you have Invoke Justice, Invoke the Ancients. These are, I guess, promoted because these strongly push you into playing a monocolor deck. So if usually playing monocolor is a slight price because you have restricted possibilities during the draft. But if you manage to snap two of those, then it pays off to be this monocolor deck or very heavy one color tilted deck because you play a super powerful card with a very, very, very restrictive casting cost. And we also have the Invoke Despair. These are all sort of like around 3.5 percentage points. And another card is a Thousand Faced Shadow, which means maybe having two. First of all, it's a good card in ninja decks in general, and second of all, having two allows you to maybe play around with this ability that it gets when you ninja it in by copying creatures, and you maybe figure out ways of abusing that mechanism better, and you have gotten your payoff card more frequently. So it's again this build round. But so Zach is saying, "Oh, Anchor to Reality." The caveat is Anchor to Reality has a very low win rate in general. So there is an increase, but still the increase doesn't push it like into a decent card category. It just says that if you have two copies, the thing works more often and will win you some more games. But still, you probably lose more games just by playing it in your deck than you win by having two copies. So the cards that improve as the two copy cards, and by two copy cards, you can see that these are mainly rares. Rare, uncommon, rare, very underdrafted and underplayed common because it's poor, and Aki Warpaint, rare. Because obviously it's much more likely that it's the rare cards that are going to be played only in two copies. Like commons, they happen so frequently in the draft that it will happen that people play three copies, so they will be in a different category. Now it's two color regressing cards. And these are the cards that drop their win rate when you add a second copy of them. And here we start, like the lowest one is the Reckoner Shakedown. And that's the discard spell. One copy is not great already. Adding a second one is just terrible. So you basically drop by 7.5 percentage points in your win rate when you add the second copy, because probably you don't want to have two copies of that effect at all in your deck. And actually, it's arguable if you want to have one copy of that in your deck. So Reckoner Shakedown is the big loser. Big surprise to me was that Hidetsugu Devouring Chaos is the second card on the list. It is a legend, so maybe, and it's a legend that sort of promotes playing a longer game because it costs 4 mana and the ability is relatively slow. So playing Hidetsugu, second Hidetsugu in your deck drops the win rate by 6.2 percentage points. Still surprising. The sample sizes are not gigantic, so there might be a lot of chaos in there involved, but at least worth noting that Hidetsugu is there. Sorry, I need to drink because they were doing the wall works today, and there's plenty of dust in the air, and I'm choking on it. Then we have Bukutai Soul Ripper. That's the vehicle rare, black vehicle rare. Like, first of all, this card is probably fine as a one-off, but maybe as a two-off, it's problematic in your black decks because black decks don't have too much of the vehicle synergy, and maybe then people try to play this along other vehicles, and it just gets out of hand because they don't have ways of crewing it. But we can speculate all we want about it. I'm not going to give you a perfect answer why the second copy of it is so bad. It drops by 6 percentage points the win rate between having one and two copies. Then we have a card that is easy to explain, Lucky Offering. You probably want one of that effect, destroying an artifact with mana value under 3. You might find one target, but it's unlikely that you will find two targets. And, finding a target is not everything. You want to find a decent target. I think that Network Terminal is the best target you can probably get for that. Or maybe, barring some rares like the Bankbuster. Lucky Offering, you probably just want to have one copy, and people rarely play it as more than one copy because you don't see it in the cards that are actually sometimes present in free copies. So they rightfully identified that if you want to play it, one copy. By the way, this is all data from best of one, so it's not nothing with sideboarding or whatnot. And probably in best of three, you will have games when you want to sideboard in 2 or 3 of them easily. Then there's Blue March. You also want to have maybe maximum one copy of it. Takanuma, Abandoned Mire. Again, I've seen quite a lot of those rare lands in this bracket, basically of cards that decrease their win rate by a bit, because you will occasionally draw 2 of them. And since this mover works like it does, drawing 2 of them in your opening hand means that you will probably have only 1-2 functional lands in your hand, which is terrible for your start. Because yes, it's fine to get that late in the game, but not early. And then we have some cards that are definitely sort of like one-offs. We have Spell Pierce, Awakened Awareness. That's this 2 mana and X. Put X +1/+1 counters on the creature, and it loses the abilities and becomes a small or something. I never played that, honestly, but it's something you don't want to have in multiple copies. Kite of Pursuit, the discard 2 spell, also you don't want multiple copies. Secluded Courtyard, you probably don't want any copies, but you definitely don't want more than one. Reckoner's Bargain, this is the Deadly Dispute kind of card with you sacrifice a creature, gain some life, and draw 2 cards. You also don't want more than one, and probably not even one. Then there's definitely a one-off, and when we were young, plus give 2 creatures +2/+2, and if you have enchantment artifact, they gain lifelink. So this card is okay as a one-off. It has pretty decent stats, but you don't want to put too many of them, and 1 is the number, it seems, in this one. And Malicious Malfunction, the same. The destroy artifact card, you want to have 1, no more than that. Weirdly, March of Otherworldly Light, which is the white march, is also in this category, that having multiple marches is not beneficial. But I think that here it might be in play that most decks that will have multiple copies will be heavy on white, and most decks that have a 1 copy will be just some kind of a soup decks that maybe have a slightly higher win rate than white control decks. But there's definitely the Malicious Malfunction when we were young, Kaito's Pursuit, and Lucky Offering, which sort of screamed to me, and Spell Pierce, which screamed to me that cards you don't want to have multiple copies of them because they're situational. So you will have decks when you probably want to have 3 copies of them, but you will play against decks when you want to have 3 copies of them, but you will also play against decks when you want to have exactly 0 copies of them. So putting multiples is a bit gambling. Putting 1 is the sort of bet hedging, and especially when you have some discard outlets, you might want to get away with it. And the weird thing, I also see Eater of Virtue here. And I think that Eater of Virtue, it's because it's legendary and it stays on the battlefield for longer periods. So if you draw the second one, you basically drew nothing for a turn. So so you might get stuck with 1 in your hand if the opponent doesn't kill the first one. So it drops the win rate. Also, as I said in the limited resources, I think that this card is overplayed. It's great in some decks. It's like mono red, it's fantastic win rate. In black red, it gets a fantastic win rate. But people play it quite frequently in those multicolor piles of value in sort of mid-range to control kind of spectrum. And there the card performs really poorly, and probably shouldn't play them in those decks. So let's move to the 3 copy cards. And here we're going to be in the world of not so commonly played commons, and uncommons will be very frequently occupying this slot, because there will be plenty of uncommons that you will manage occasionally to get 3 copies of, and that's why the sample size for them will be just big enough for us to do the analysis. So let's first look at the all-star 3 copy cards in the format. So these are the cards that have the highest win rate when there's 3 copies of them in your deck, as compared to the 2 copies and 1 copy. And yeah, I mean, the winner of that is Life of Toshiro Umezawa with the massive 7 percentage point increase in win rate when you have 3 of them as opposed to when you have 1 of them in your deck. And very close behind it, there is the Touch the Spirit Realm, which is also... This actually surprised me a bit, but I guess if you have a green-white enchantment deck, having 3 copies of that is just busted because you can win with everything, remove the threats, and so on and so on. So yeah, Life of Toshiro and Touch the Spirit Realm, really solid improvement when you have multiple copies of them. So this data suggests that probably having a 4th one is not going to harm you too much either. Behind it, there's a pack of like 4 cards, and we have Patchwork Automaton, Generous Visitor, Blossom Prancer, and Behold the Unspeakable. All 4 of them in a sort of 6 to 5 percentage point increase in the win rate. Again, very good cards. 2 of them very good early cards, which you might want to have multiple copies because that increases your chance of having them in your opening hand. 2 of them amazing value cards, which is also good to have them so you can play them exactly when they appear on the curve. Then we have our common for this bunch, Harmonious Emergence. This is the 4 mana aura that enchants a land and it becomes a 4/5 vigilant creature. Turns out that having multiples of them is beneficial for you if you get around a 5 percentage point boost. The card is not bad as a single one, so actually it seems like strategy of playing multiple Harmonious Emergences is not a terrible one. And I saw this sort of similar data for power creatures in general in this format. So it seems to me like if you can build a deck that reliably plays like 4/4/4/4/4/4/4/4, you will overwhelm your opponent quite frequently. Especially that the 4 toughness is sort of like dodging the red removal almost completely. Then we have the Lord Tupperware special, the Fall of Lord Conduct, which actually is way better as a 3 copies of than as a 1 copy of, which is counterintuitive to me and surprising. So I don't know what to make of this particular data point. Yeah, I don't know. Then there's Besiege, which is Skyward. The card is just busted. La la la. You thin your deck. You basically play a couple of them, and then you never draw a land in your game again. So that's good. We have Long Reach of the Night. I guess this is the same thing. Like the card is good as a one-off because you discard 2 cards most of the time, and maybe sometimes nab a creature. But if you play multiple copies of them, it becomes true attrition because they will run out of cards. They will either have to draw something and skip playing it just to protect their creature, or they will play something, but then they will have to pay a creature for that, and then that happens twice for each copy of the Long Reach of the Night, which makes it an excellent attrition tool. And I mean, I played some games where I only had 1 copy, but I managed to ninjutsu it back into my hand and replay it, and well, that was in most cases game set match from my side because the opponent could not come back from that kind of loss. Then we have Tawashi Guidebot, the weird 2/1 artifact. You can put a +1/+1 counter on something when it comes ATBs. And having multiples seems to be good because they will all put +1/+1 counters on something. And the thing with Tawashi Guidebot is that the ability that it has is 4 mana, tap, draw a card. It costs 1 less for each modified creature you control. So if you play multiples, you obviously make it at least 2 mana cheaper to use, and then you have 2 of them, so you can, like, you know, for 4 mana you can draw 2 cards every turn if you want. And if you have something else that has a counter already, then for 2 mana you can draw 2 cards, and yeah, it becomes a very, very good engine for the late game, and might be even played in some kind of like a top end in some kind of red aggro deck if you need to. Then another interesting card, another very underperforming card, but it seems to be pretty decent when you have multiples in your deck and you dedicate the deck towards playing it. So it's sort of built around it, very much like I think Tawashi Guidebot is sort of built around it. And it's Covert Technician. It's a 3 mana 2/4, and it can ninjutsu for 2, if I'm not mistaken. And when it deals combat damage to the opponent, you can put an artifact that costs 2 or less into battlefield. So I guess that it's an artifact itself. So I guess like this is like a card for either mono blue or a red blue artifact kind of deck where you have a lot of things to put with it. So if you have multiple copies, you sort of ensure that that you're going to put something into battlefield for cheaps. So for instance, if you attack with the Network Disruptor, you bounce it to your hand, hit with the Covert Ignition, you can replay it for free if you really want to, or you can play some 2-mana artifact to get more value. I don't know, like Ecologist Terrarium or something. Then we have Michiko's Reign of Truth, the cranial plating for enchantments and artifacts saga. And this is also obvious that why is it good? I mean, if you are really in a heavily dedicated enchantment deck, having 3 Michiko's Reigns of Truth is going to make sure that your opponent is dead, especially when you have something with flying or with trample. Yeah. And we have last couple of cards in that category. Mobilizer Mech is interesting. I guess that having multiples is super annoying because it is a 3/4 flyer. And they cascade. So Mobilizer Mech is a 2-mana, 3/4 flying vehicle. It has crew 3, if I'm not mistaken. And when it becomes crewed, it crews something else automatically. So the point is, crew cost is very high because you need to pay the crew 3 to make it into a creature. But if it can crew something else, then you sort of have a discount on crewing. So it can crew something with crew 5, for example, for free. So you pay 3 to crew it, and then it crews for free something that says crew 5, or even crew 1, or even crew 2, whatever. You get a discount. It makes much more manageable, but it's built for a heavy vehicle deck. So it's also not super surprising to me that when you have 3 copies of it, it's better, because when you have 3 copies of it, you're definitely already in the heavy vehicle deck, which this card was made to support. The problem is, of course, that the heavy vehicle decks are not great. And in case of this card, we are probably looking at something that having 1 copy of it in your deck is not exactly great. And that's why having 3 is better. And the last card we have is Bearer of Memory. Having 3 copies is better. But there we have to look at the different bias of it. It's basically, if you want to play 3 of them, you're definitely in a very heavy enchantment deck, which means, and very heavy enchantment decks are quite good. So probably that's why we're having 3 copies of Bearer of Memory is good. That's the 3-mana 3/2 enchantment creature that for 6 mana puts a +1/+1 counter and gives trample to something. You put it because you wanted enchantments, and then you have a lot of enchantments and your deck is decent. Now, looking at this list, there's a couple of things you need to remember. Like, it's not only that having 3 lives of Toshiro Umezawa is just so much busted that the win rate increases by 7.1 percentage points. But if you're sitting at a pod where you get 3 lives of Toshiro Umezawa, you very likely be in the pod where black is really, really open, and that will impact the win rate. So don't forget about this, that it's not only the card, it's also the reality of the draft that you were in. If you have 3 Touch the Spirit Realms in your deck, it means that no one at the pod was probably drafting white. So you have to keep in mind that those numbers are particularly important, but you also have to keep in mind that this makes the numbers of cards being bad when you have multiple copies more important, because that means that they're really, really bad. People are asking where is Onicult Anvil, and I'm talking, be patient. We'll get there. We'll get to the Onicult Anvil. I wouldn't miss that card. I know people love it. So looking at the 3 copy cards in your deck, and the biggest loser is sort of Crackling Emergence. And yeah, that card just like drops by almost 6 percentage points when you have 3 copies of it. You don't want to play multiples. You maybe can play 1 if you need your modified creature for the deck. Second lowest is Asari Captain. That drops by 5.5 percentage points when you have 3 copies in your deck. It's probably too expensive. It's a 5 drop that is not like amazing, so you just probably want to stick with playing fewer of them. If I remember correctly, the data when I was doing it, it's actually that 1 copy is fine, 2 copies are still okay-ish, and then there's a big drop of after 2 copies. So actually having 2 copies is better than having... So all these cards are having... 2 copies are better than 1, but 3 copies is there is a big drop off. And Asari Captain is one of those cards. So it's better to have 2 of them, but 3 of them is a big drop. Keep in mind again here that we're talking about sometimes pretty small samples, so that might be the result of variance, not necessarily a result of not necessarily a result of actual data. But the Kuchi Silencer, again, having 3 copies seems not beneficial. That's the 2/1 ninja that when it deals combat damage, you can discard a creature card to kill something. That's also okay as a 1 of or as a 2 of, but 3 is probably too much. Lich Gauntlet. Turns out that you can't have any number of 2/2 lifelinkers in your deck. You need to have other things in this format. Season of Renewal, and this I think is a pretty strong result. It drops by 4 percentage points when you have 3 copies, but it's very, very good as a 2 copies. And I think that this is a signal of saturation of this particular card. So it's you don't want to have 5 copies of Season of Renewal, because you will have hands when you draw multiple of them and you won't have anything to renew. So that averts the point. You want to have some of them, and you want to have ways of getting this back to your hand, so you can loop the loop whatever you want, but you don't want to saturate your deck with Seasons of Renewal, and you want to play maybe fewer. Rabbit Battery is another card on that list, also around 4 percentage points drop in the win rate when you put the 3rd copy. And this was a surprise to me, because I think that I didn't expect seeing this result. I treat this result extremely suspicious, because I see a very different picture for the monkey equipment, which doesn't compute with me. So here I would suspect that this is something with the sample size, but I got the results I'm going to present to you. I'm just going to add the caveats. And there's Prosperous Thief. I guess this is also the card that is powerful when it hits the board, because other creatures you control will do the damage and not it. So having multiples is not giving you that much, because you will get more mana, okay, but you probably don't need that much more mana. It's very good to have it early, and later it becomes a sort of liability, because you just draw a 3/2 later in the game that doesn't do that much. Here we have the Blade Blizzard Kitsune. That's also 3 percentage points lower. And Containment Construct, that it's fine to have 2 copies, but 3 copies might be a bit too much, by 2.5 percentage points drop in win rate. And again, here we have a card that having extra copy doesn't change anything. So maybe having 3 in your deck doesn't change much, because from 1 you already get the effect of exiling the discarded card. From 2 you don't get any bonus. Okay. I'm losing my voice because of the dust in the air. And here we have cards that are in a totally different world. These are the cards that the win rate is highest when at the 1st copy, and any copy beyond that drops the win rate. And here I showed you the difference in win rate between having 3 and 1 copies. So the biggest loser is Repel the Vile, the 4 mana exile enchantment or creature with power 4 or greater. And this is classic 1-off in my opinion, the card. You see a steady drop as you add the copies. You probably want to play only 1 of them in your deck. But Playing one is actually pretty decent. It has a pretty acceptable to good win rate as a one-off, but um, but adding more is a bit problematic. And then we have Dead to the Kami. You also don't want to have multiple copies of that. Kami of Restless Shadows, you might try to play as a one-off. They both drop by like 6 percentage points. Furthermore, Chainplay Centipede, I think that this is again like you want to have maybe one is okay, but multiples is not great in your decks, because if you have those aggressive artifact decks, you also don't want to have too much of the 3-drop slot. I learned very painfully recently by playing my deck. Web Spinner Cuff, that's the one for creature that can turn into an equipment that gives reach. You want exactly one of those in your deck. And this, I looked at the data of this card individually, and the drop is literally like 1 copy, 2 copies, 3 copies, almost in a straight line. So basically, the more of them you add, the worse for you. One is good. It's fine. It's a very playable card, but not multiples of them. Thirst of Knowledge, not great card, but I mean, it's a great card, not great card in this particular set, and definitely multiples is even decreasing it. 5 percentage point drop off between playing 1 and 3. And same Cyber Trespasser. This is a unique effect. This is the 5 mana 3/5 artifact creature, but it has a channel, and you can tap the creatures. They don't tap until end of turn. This is the Falter effect basically, and if you know your fundamentals, you probably want like 1 Falter effect in your deck, and no more than that. So just don't play more. That's it. Orochi Merchkeeper, that's a ramping creature. You also don't want to have more than one of those. Guardians of Obora, the 3/4 wall. You might want to have one, but no more, because it costs 3 mana again. You want to maybe have your roadblock creatures to be a bit cheaper, so they can deal with explosive starts when people play 1-drop, 2-drop. Crypto Mario asks, did you also compare 0 copies versus 1 copy? So no, because it would be tricky, because then I would have to select a random sample of decks with the same colors combinations as the decks that have 1 copy, and it would be way too much work for me to prepare like this to 3-4 hours to make, and I will be looking probably at like 20 hours to prepare the proper 0 copy sample, and I think that the extra work is just not worth the merit in this particular case. Runaway Trashbot, again, 4 percentage points drop. Befriending the Moths, that's another card that looks sort of like a one-off. That's the saga that sends your creature into the air and lets you attack in the air as a +1/+1 and turns into a 2/4 flyer. You also want one that effect, because it's sort of combat trick or pre-combat trick, like ways of gaining reach with your deck. If you put too many of those effects, you don't have enough things that will put you in the spot when you're actually gaining this reach. And I mean reach here in ability to deal extra damage to the opponent's face. You want to drop them to 5 life and then play Befriending the Moths and then deal extra damage. If you put too many Befriending the Moths, you might have problems of dropping your opponent to 5 life. That's okay. We have Roaring Earth, and this is again, you don't want multiple of these cards, because it puts counters on creatures when you play a land, and if you put too many of them, you don't have enough creatures, so its effect will be diluted by the fact that you might not have anything to put your counters on. And it also can channel into a sort of combat trick, and combat tricks are probably better as a one-off in your deck, unless you have a like super specific build. And Short Circuit, whatever, Disruption Protocol, whatever. I'm just going to skip those so that we can move on. Okay, we move to the 4 copy cards. Now we're talking about the best improvers. Here we have Kappa Tech Wrecker. Remind you, this card has a really, really good win rate as a 1 copy of in your deck. A really, really good win rate. as a 4-off, because some people managed to get 4 Kappa Tech Wreckers in their deck, and the sample size is over 100. So not some, quite some people managed to get 4 Kappa Tech Wreckers. I think that, you know, in the early format, it was maybe undervalued by the general population. It increases by 11 percentage points when you have 4 of them. So yeah, they are not invincible. They only have, if I remember correctly, 70% win rate. So, you know, they win 3 games out of 10 if you have 4 Kappa Tech Records. So yeah, if you're very unlucky, 9% of them will go 0-3. Is it, did I calculate? No, not 9. Jesus Christ. 9% will go 0-2, and then they will start winning. Okay, I don't want to do the cube of that, but it will be 2.7% of them will go 0-3. Then we have our Onicult Anvil, back with the popular demand. Decks with 4 copies of Onicult Anvil have 10.3 percentage point increase over decks with 1 copy. And decks with 1 copy were not exactly poor either. So these 2 cards are head and shoulders above anything else in terms of increase. So I think that most of these cards with like the biggest increase in this category of cards that we found enough games with 4 copies of the card in the deck are going to be very, very, very underestimated at the beginning of the season, uncommons and uncommons, because people managed to get multiple copies of them in the early format because people still didn't have them evaluated in the right spot, and in some drafts you just randomly open 4 of them and they just like probably wheeled all over the place. And it's an interesting data, but it's going to be very, very difficult to get a 4 Kappa Tech Record deck in the current format because A, people that play only week 1, 2 don't play anymore. So it's more grinders per table on average. And B, people know that Kappa Tech Wrecker is a wrecker, literally. So yeah. Both of those cards, I think, early format were underappreciated. And third one is Enthusiastic Mechanaut, which I think it's not really underestimated because the card is not brilliant. But if you are lucky and you open multiple copies of them and you can get them, it can lead to some really interesting decks, because if you will have 3 of them or 4 of them, you can really start thinking about putting more expensive artifacts because you know that they will be cheaper. So, you know, I'm not a super big fan of this 4 mana 3/4 that you can sacrifice an artifact and it gets +2/+1, because for 4 mana it is a bit nah. But for 3 mana, I'm extremely interested in playing multiple copies of that card. So if I have 3 Enthusiastic Mechanauts, I can put more of them. So Yami Kuribo is saying 3 Anvils bad for good. No. It's 3 Anvils good, 4 Anvils very good. This doesn't tell you. This is the difference between 1 copy and 4 copies. 3 Anvils is fine. It's fine. It's fine. That Jordan says that he just trophied with 3 Anvils. Pathetic. Play 4. You heard it here in the seminar, you should play 4. Much better win rate than with 3. No, probably just like a couple of percentage points in here between 3 copies and 4 copies. Another card we have, Suit Up. And again, not every deck will want to play 4 copies of Suit Up, but I think early in the format it was easy to get them, and people that played multiple copies were probably winning like a lot of games just based on that. So normally you don't want to play too many of the combat tricks, but Suit Up has a cantrip, so it replaces itself, which means that you're pretty unlikely to run out of targets for it, because they draw a card and that will draw you the extra creature that you can replace. Plus, it's a combat trick that usually makes your creature win the combat and kill the opponent's blocker. So you should be fine because you keep your original creature. And weirdly, and these are around 7.77 percentage points increase, the Mechanaut and Suit Up. Now weirdly we have Bamboo Grove Archer, which has the highest win rate when you have 4 copies of it. And here we come to one of the caveats I said in the beginning of the seminar. Not in every deck the 4 copies of Bamboo Grove Archer will be. But I'm damn sure I played decks where having 4 copies would have been brilliant because they just clog the board early in the game, allow you to survive till the late game. And once you survive till the late game, you know you're going to win because your deck was designed to win when you go into the late game. So this is probably like very build specific when it's really good, when you really need it, and in those decks it becomes really good. Here we have Oath. I know I said in limited resources that the highest win rate is when you have 5 copies, but unfortunately it didn't make the cut in terms of number of games that I need for this analysis. So yes, it has an even higher win rate when you have 5 copies, but it was under 100 games that was based on. So I only got the reliable data with 4 games because that has around 900 games in it. And it has 6.3 percentage points higher win rate as a 4-off than as a 1-off. And actually, as a 1-off win rate of Oath is good, but not amazing. So I think it's actually 2 percentage points lower than decks with 1 Kappa Tech record. So you really want to have multiple Oaths. Luckily, people still give you multiples if you need them. Okay. Then we have a couple of cards from the artifact decks. That Jordan is in the chat. He's the expert on those. We have the Iron Apprentice, best when you have 4 copies of them, and Unstoppable Ogre, best when you have 4 copies in them. Again, like with the Bamboo Grove Archer, these 2 cards are very specific to one, maybe 2 archetypes. So mono red or maybe red with a bit of black for the Oni Cult Anvils. Then we have Jukai Preserver, a card that slightly surprised me, but I already talked to you when we had 3-copy cards about the Harmonious Emergence. Is it Harmonious Emergence? Yes, Harmonious Emergence. That those 4/4 creatures, when you play one after another, they can attrition out the opponent because they can't do much about them, especially when they are red, which seems to be every opponent I play now on the ladder is. What do we have later? Careful Cultivation, and this is again I think something that is build specific, but here we are entering the realms of really small improvements. So Careful Cultivation, 4.4 percentage points, that's still okay. It's probably in the decks that really want to ramp, and it can happen. Armguard Familiar, that's probably like those blue decks that have multiple Enthusiastic Mechanauts because you can play them for 1 mana, and with red, the problem is that most of your artifacts cost 1 red, so the Enthusiastic Mechanaut doesn't give them any kind of boost, and while the Armguard Familiar is actually cheaper because of that. Then a weird result is Imperial Subduer, the Samurai Tapper, but I guess if you play multiple of them, you can just attack and your creature is practically unblockable, because it taps whatever can block it favorably, and you are just left with something that can only chump it. We have Gloom Shrieker that has a slight boost when you have multiple copies, and I think, from my recent tries of playing black-green, I think that only versions that I had success with are the ones that can do some kind of graveyard loops and recursion, and the ones that just based on pure power were slightly underwhelming if you didn't put that extra element of recursion. And then we have a bunch of cards that I think are best at 4 copies, but their power level, independently of having 1, 2, 3, or 4 copies, is relatively flat. And that's like Fang of Shigeki, Golden Tail Disciple, Wondrous Intervention, Inkrise Infiltrator. These are all around 2 percentage points improvement at 4. And Uncharted Haven and Intercessor's Arrest, which have a sort of like 0.2, 0.3 percentage point improvement over 1 copy. And when you look at the graphs of those cards, like Uncharted Haven is just basically flat. Independent of how many copies you put, it has roughly the same win rate. So that's interesting to know. Okay. Oh yeah, thank you for the sub, Mercurio. The weekly sub from Mercurio. People learn from him. Yeah, learn from him. Very, very good viewer. So we have cards that have 4 copies, but they drop off after 3 by quite a lot. And again, bit of it will be variance because of the small sample sizes, but bit of it might be results. The biggest drop off is Nezumi Blade Blesser, and I can see why would that happen. It's 9 percentage points. So the win rate between having 3 and 4 copies is difference is 9 percentage points. Card is good. Don't get me wrong. It's got a pretty high win rate at 3 copies. But maybe putting 4 is just like making sure that you won't get the double synergy, or you will have a lower chance of getting synergies. And I know that 1 copy extra is not too much, but you probably don't want to overstack on them because they will not get the bonus from being there. You also want to have like some Kamis of Terrible Secrets in those decks and things like that. So so maybe you don't want to put everything into Nezumi Blade Blessers. Geothermal Kamis, you probably want to restrict yourself to 3. So these are the cards, by the way, just to be clear, these are the cards where 3 copies has the highest win rate, and then there's a drop-off. Kumano drops as a... so 3 copies of Kumano have a 6 percentage point higher win rate than 4. And this is, again, like, yes, you want to play it on turn 1, but you want to play a creature on turn 2. If you put too many Kumano Faces Kakazan, you play 20 of them, you don't get the second chapter boost, which is quite important in the power of that card. You know, the best opening is like Kumano Faces Kakazan into the Song Shaper, and then a couple of artifacts on turn 3, and you're in the game. But if you have like open a hand with some 3-drop and 2 Kumano Faces Kakazans, it's much less powerful than that opening. So you want to make sure that you have your 1 and 2 drops, not too many 3 drops in those artifact decks. Correct me if I'm wrong, to Jordan. Yeah, and then we have Commune with Spirits. You don't want to have too many because probably you don't have too many lands if you do that. And you might be, you know, the biggest problem with card like Commune with Spirits, like probably you can play any number of them in a mono green deck, but the moment when you play a 2-color deck and you trim your land count to 16 because you play 4 Communes with Spirits, you will not get the green on some stages, and then you're stuck with what you count as a land in your deck, but it's not really because you need green mana for it specifically. Then we have Prodigy's Prototype. Seems 3 is good, but 4 is a bit too much. I guess that this again has this little balance in between how many creatures and vehicles you can play in your deck. And actually, this is the question that I asked anonymously, so don't tell him. Korkos, the next episode of the podcast will be questions that you are ashamed to ask in person, but you want to ask anonymously. So on my question that I ask anonymously because I'm ashamed to asking it is like, I was not there when vehicle as a mechanic was developed, and I always found it confusing. What should be the ratios of vehicles to creatures in your deck, and because, you know, like I'm really dumb when I see them. I see like a vehicle and think, yeah, that's sort of a creature, no? And then you just like sit with like 3 vehicles on board and nothing to crew them, and you're like, man, no, they're not creatures, are they? So I actually asked the question to Korokos to instruct me on how to use vehicles in terms of numbers and rule of thumbs. Yeah, and then we have some cards that have a lower drop of like Mukutai Ambusher, Iron Hoof Boar, Searchlight Companion, Jukai Naturalist. Turns out that this card is not better when you have a million copies of them, which is strange. But that's another 2/2 life thinker that just doesn't work as well as they did in the previous things. Silver Fur Master, Kitsune Ace, Cloying Torment, and Jukai Training. All of those things are slightly lower as a 4-of, but they're still pretty decent, most of them, because they're pretty good as 3-ofs. So it means that there might be some saturation, but it's not massive, and you shouldn't probably worry. If you have 4 copies, you can play them easily. Now, Some cards have a very small sample size in terms of how many cards are in a particular category. So I did graphs to maybe make you see the changes in the win rate a bit better. And here I have two offs, which are the cards that they maximize their win rate at 2 copies per deck. So 2 copies have a higher win rate than 1 copy. In all cases, very minimally better than as a 1 copy. So don't put too much stock into that. And then adding extra copies is actually making the win rate drop quite steeply. And we have 5 cards in this category, and that's Fate into Antiquity. So think about it. You probably want to play 2. 3 would be a stretch, unless it's the best of 3 and you sideboarded it in because you know your opponent's deck. Then you have Moth Rider Patrol, which is sort of okay till 3 copies. The drop is very minimal there, but then it's quite steeply drops as 4th copy enters, so you don't want to play too much of that. Sunblade Samurai, and here we might run into a different problem. It's probably you play 1 or 2 copies in any deck that has Oaths, but you will probably only play 3 copies of it in a white deck, and then they might have a slightly lower win rate than Multicolor Soup with Oaths. That will be the other case when you use the card, so that might be based on deck composition. I didn't look in those numbers, so I don't know. Then we have Skyward McCoy and Tales of Master Sashiro as the 2 cards that drop. Tails are almost identical with Fade into Antiquity, so you really want to have maximum 2 copies. That's probably have to do with the fact that it's a 5 drop and that needs some creatures to be on board, so it's not exactly like situational, but you don't want to overload on your 5 drops that don't impact the board as they enter too much, because that +1/+1 counter might not always be very relevant. And Skyward McCoy is again 4 drop 3/3 flyer, something that you don't want to have more than 1 probably in your deck. Yeah, exactly. Mati Borg says that it's more than just the deck composition. A 5 mana 4/4 isn't good for its ability. It has a vigilance, which is actually I found quite often relevant in this format. But you're right. You want to have 1 or 2 copies because you want to find your planes and you don't want to put planes in your deck. And the next ones you have to play them as creatures, which is slightly less good. And you can do that with 1. But if you have multiples, it will just like it's not powerful enough for those multicolor decks even. So I couldn't test it, unfortunately, due to lack of time. But it's a good question. So Woodfeld says, do you think the data is skewed at all by good players knowing that 4 copies of Sunblade Samurai isn't wise, so it's only worse players playing 4 copies? There might be something of it. We'll touch the topic in the second part of the seminar, but I would have to test it. And you know what? I'm definitely going to test it when next time I'm doing this card copy seminar with the different set, where I will maybe focus more on interesting results and player quality comparisons. But I did a couple of those tests, and there was not that much in it. And obviously the problem is like how you define best players, by their win rate or by being in Mythic, or it's always problematic. But yeah, as I said, as I always say, there's so many biases that you need to eliminate from this data that usually first round of an analysis misses a couple. Then you do it second time and it still misses a couple. Then maybe third time you get it like more or less all right. So these are the cards that are overplayed, because basically very often you will see that people play 4 copies, but their win rate is actually highest at the 1 copy. And there's 2 categories of cards here. First one is Tamiya's Completion, which actually the highest win rate is at the 1 copy, but it doesn't drop off at all. And you can see, especially at this between 3 and 4 copies, it actually increases while all the other ones drop quite dramatically. So I think that Tamiyo's completion is fine to play as multiple copies. It's just like by chance it has a slightly higher win rate at one copy, but it's relatively flat across the whole spectrum. Then there is cards that are one-offs, sort of, and that's Greater Tanuki. The card is good as a one-off, but it drops off rapidly when people try to play more of them. So you probably don't want to play. You don't want to play multiple copies of Greater Tanuki. Basically, you just want to have the one. And then there are cards that are just not good, and they even decrease with the copy numbers. And here we have Coiling Stalker, Dragon Spark Reactor, and Undercity Scrounger. I think that a lot of content creators singled out those particular cards as traps, and I definitely did my job on Dragon Spark Reactor. Plenty of people I heard talking about Undercity Scrounger, and Coiling Stalker was the last episode of Mystical Dispute. It's not great. I mean, it's got 53% win rate. That's, that's below the average for 17 lands. Don't play Dragon Spark Reactor, please don't. Oh no, do play Dragon Spark Reactor against me, please do. As the says, I was high on Tanuki at spoiler. Yes, me too, and it was a bit of a disappointment. So these are the cards that are sort of like overplayed as at 4 copies. We will still get, I think that there are there? No. And these are the last category of cards that are overplayed. Now we go to the cards that go this one extra level and you get 5 copy data of them. So first of all, there's All-Stars. 9 cards that just consequently increase their win rate and peaking at 5 copies in terms of win rate. Again, here, think about it. If you draft 5 Okiba Reckoner raids, I pretty sure guess that black is going to be open in that pod. So there is not only the effect of the card, but also the effect of openness of the color, which means you get like everything that you need. And we have we have a bunch of the red things: Kami's Flare, Voltage Surge, Experimental Synthesizer, Simian Sling. Cards that will be frequently open because people weaned off red and left the color open. And as many people in this chat will attest, you can draft mono red decks quite reliably in some pods. In some pods you will not be able to because red is drafted. But if you see the signals that red is very open, go in. And then you can draft this ultra aggressive mono red artifacts decks, and 4 of the cards in this 9 all-star list is from that deck. Again, Kami's Flare, Voltage Surge, Experimental Synthesizer, and Simian Sling. And there's this like really strong commons. We have Modern Age, we have Spirited Companion, we have Moon Snare Specialist, which I think is becoming better in Multitude because you can do all the shenanigans with ninjutsu bouncing things all over the place. Network Disruptor, because the more of them you have, the more enabling of the ninjutsu you will get. That also gets the increase. And there is the most all-starry of the all-stars, the Okiba Reckoner raid, the card that's starts at around 57% win rate and goes up to 67 at 5 copies. Yeah, Simian Sling was a bit of a surprise for me as well, especially with the very bad numbers of the Rabbit Battery, which makes me think that there is something dodgy with the Rabbit Battery numbers. I know there's a slight difference between Simian Sling and the Rabbit Battery, but still, maybe, like when you have multiple copies of Rabbit Batteries, they cannot push through the damage, but when you have multiple copies of Simian Sling, you can push through the damage quite easily. Yeah, but so JPSN54 says that the jump of Simian Sling from 3 copies when it has around 57% win rate to 4 copies when it has around 62% win rate is massive. But if you draw a trend line, it's probably like that here you get slightly under the variance goes slightly lower, and here it boosts a bit. If you would like sort of push them back, it probably would be more or less linear kind of increase of the win rate. And most of those cards have almost a linear increase of the win rate. I think the only exception is like Kami Flare, which looks like a flat level power level card that just by pure chance has the highest win rate at 5 copies, because maybe the color was so open if you get 5 of them. Okay. And we have last category, and these are weird cards that you find them played as the 5 copies, but it's not probably optimal to play them at 5 copies. So we have 4 cards that do that. I'll start with Moon Circuit Hacker, which has a very high win rate. It increases up to 4 copies, and then you have to sort of stabilize at 5. So there's not much difference between 4 and 5. Still, it should be like an all-star level, but it just didn't reach that same thing as the other ones did, where the 5 copies had the highest win rate. It has a slightly lower win rate. Still great card, should be played in multiples, it's great. Then we have Tawashi Song Shaper, which starts around 55% as a one-off, and then peaks at 4 copies at around 50, 57, 58. And then drops off slightly, but drops off to like, again, 50, 56 and a half, 57. So there's a small drop off when you have 5 copies, but I wouldn't put much stock into it either. Then there's a Ganjo Exemplar, which has a poor win rate to start with. People try to play multiple copies of it. But it peaks at 4 copies with like 54% win rate. So it's not great. And this is the card that looks to me like it has a sort of like a stable 53% and is played in multiples. It doesn't give you that much. And I think the most interesting card in there, Virus Beetle, which starts at around 57% point win rate as 1 copy. With 2 copies, you get 58. Then it goes up to 60, almost 61 at 3 copies. Stays at 60 with 4 copies, and then drops to 49% win rate. So from 60% as a 4-off to 49% as a 5-off. And again, I'm pretty sure variance plays a role here, but I do think that Virus Beetle is not the card that you want to play as many copies as you physically can, because unlike the Spirit Companion, when it's always good to draw a card, the effect of the Virus Beetle is sort of disappearing at a certain stage of the game. And then it just becomes a 1-1 for 2, which is not great. So data suggests that the optimum is 3, maybe sometimes 4 is okay, but I don't think that you should push it over 5, which is like a terrible, terrible, terrible dilemma that you're going to have so many times in the drafts. Oh no, should I pick that 5th Virus Beetle? I don't know. Well, anyway, we went through all the categories possible. So here we go with the card copy seminar. But there is a bonus part of it, and this is about Okiba Salvage. So as I told you, Mystical Dispute made an episode on cards that are underplayed or have low win rate, and they were deciding whether it's a never playable, sometimes playable, or rarely playable, and they disputed their findings. They also asked their readers which card is the card that has a low win rate and you still feel comfortable playing in this format, and I picked Okiba Salvage as my answer, but I didn't motivate it very well. Now, Okiba Salvage is a 5-mana sorcery, 1 black and 4 colorless. Return target creature or vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Then you put +2/+1/+1 counters on that permanent if you control both an artifact and an enchantment. Now, first of all, notice that there's a then there. So if you return an enchantment creature and you had an artifact, you get the bonus. If you return an artifact creature and you had an enchantment in play, you get the bonus. So that's... you might only need 1 of them if you have a suitable target in your graveyard, which is nice to know. I like the card. I think it has a role in some decks. I wouldn't slam it into everything that you physically can. So I decided to check what works in that deck. And I did several tests, and I'm going to show you the results, and then you'll see what kind of a painful life analyzing Magic data can be. So first of all, I said, okay, the card is better when you get the bonus. So I divided the decks into the decks that have 5 to 7 wins as the successful decks, 4 to 3 wins as a sort of medium, and 0 to 2 as poor results. And I thought, okay, you want to get the 2+1/+1 counters on the creature, because then the card becomes really busted. I mean, 5-mana reanimator that gives +2/+2 to your creature that you reanimate is not bad. And I thought, surely the good decks must have a higher number of the limited boost factor. Limiting boost factor is what I called the lowest number of the either artifacts or enchantments in your deck. So if you have 7 artifacts, 4 enchantments, the limiting factor will be 4. If you have 3 artifacts and 9 enchantments, the limiting factor will be 3. The lower number of the particular card type in your deck. So on average, decks with 7 to 5 wins had 4.65 of the lowest card type that was limiting it to have the boosted version of Okiba Salvage. Decks with 4-3 wins, 4.77. Decks with 2-0 wins, 4.58. There are some differences, but they don't show any consistent trend, and they are within the fractions of the number. So don't see anything that will really make the good decks play it more frequently for the extra value. So so yeah, no conclusion there. I mean, I can't see that the good decks, the winning decks, are going to be casting it much easier in its extra value. So then I thought, you know what? It's good with large channel creatures. So maybe the decks that won a lot had more copies of those large channel creatures. I'm talking Turtle, Tanuki. I put the Samurai in there as well, because I think that the 6/6 Vigilance is a pretty decent thing. And of course, the Mirror Shell Crab. So yeah, I didn't see any trend here either. The 7 to 5 win decks have 0.81 copies of those large channel creatures that I selected as a category, 0.75 copies in 4 to 3 win decks, and 0.84 copies in the 2 to 0 win decks. So nothing. But I tested it. I just didn't get any kind of consistent reply in terms of deck building. Then I thought, but you can play other creatures, but you need discard outlets for those, because if you manage to discard something early and then you reanimate it, maybe Skyscraper or something, whatever, maybe that will be better. So I thought maybe the decks that have more wins have more discard outlets. And I counted things like Network Terminal, the Modern Age saga, even the Sky Swimmer Koi or whatnot, it discards. Dokuchi Silencer, which is a neat way, it's a black creature, so it already is in the color. You can sort of ninjutsu it in, discard a creature card that you will reanimate later to kill their creature, and then you reanimate the thing that you discarded. And they're like, yeah, great combo. No. I don't see any trend there either. So actually, the decks with 7 to 5 wins have fewer number of discard outlets of 0.52 per deck, but the difference is just cosmetic. It's 0.58 for the 4 to 3 wins deck and 0.55 for 2 to 0 win decks. Nothing here. So let's add up. There is no difference in how often you will get the boost from casting the Okiba Salvage. There is no difference in the number of large channel creatures that will allow you to get something big into the graveyard early so you can reanimate it early. And there is no difference in the number of discard outlets that would let you discard non-channeling large creatures to your graveyard to reanimate them later. Nothing. I decided I'll take a last look at one thing, and I will say player quality. Very generally, I'll answer that in the questions time after the seminar, because we're almost there. Last thing I looked is the rank and how many decks of particular category are there in each rank. And here I saw one trend at least. Players in Mythic do much better. They don't train wreck with decks that have Okiba Salvage in them. On average, players in Silver, Gold, Platinum, and Diamond, they have run 50% of the decks that go 0 to 2 wins with this card in their deck, which is quite a lot. Mythic players, only 43% of that. And, we're talking about sample sizes that go into hundreds. So, yeah, that should be big enough. So there is a markedly fewer train wrecks when you play Okiba Salvage when you're in Mythic. I assume Mythic players know more about how to construct a deck because they're usually players with decent win rate, decent ability, because they can compete with other decent players and still have a positive win rate as per 17 lands users. They also have the highest win rate of those good decks that have 5 to 7 wins. The difference is not massive, but you have to keep in mind that Silver and Gold 17 lands users have a much higher win rate than the Mythic ones. So the fact to me that Mythic players with lower win rate, because they compete against good players themselves, winning or trophying more frequently than Silver players who play against, well, arguably beginning players in most cases because they have such a high win rate. This for me is a data point. This suggests that there is something that Mythic players do have that that doesn't exist in the lower bracket. And you can see that, like Diamond players who also have the lowest win rate of all the players groups in 17 lands also have a quite high win rate with Okiba Salvage. So Mercury is saying, I found bronze silver players to be pretty fierce competition. And that's probably because when you're paired with the bronze silver player, you're paired with the bronze silver player that is on the heater, because otherwise they wouldn't be paired with a higher rank, which means that they can be a good player with a very high win rate in general, plus they can be a player with a very strong deck, which makes it makes those competitions quite fierce. And I agree with you. I'm not feeling happy when I'm in Diamond and I'm getting paired against someone in Silver, because I think there'll be trouble. I'd rather be paired with someone in Mythic, to be fair, and I think I might have a higher win rate when I'm paired with someone from Mythic when I'm in a lower division than when I'm playing against someone in Silver Gold then I'm playing in a higher division. But anyway, let's go back to the seminar. So what this data suggests, and it doesn't prove anything, but it does suggest, is that there is something in play patterns in there. I would assume Mythic players to be better players because they play more, they play with better competition on average, and yet they win more with the cards. So cards like this are tricky to play. You need to time them well, you need to set them up well, you need to construct the deck that will make it as beneficial as possible to play it. You need to know when you go for the aggressive gameplay, when you want to play it on turn 5 and get a big threat on board, or when you want to play it as an attrition mechanism, when you will trade your big threats with the opponent's big threats and then regain something as a mechanism of attrition, because it will be even bigger after it comes back, after it already traded a couple of times. So you need to balance those couple of things, and I would love to be able to answer every single question with this simplistic data based only on deck composition, but you can't. And I think that the lesson from here is that there is still a lot of potential for the data analysis and for answering the questions that are related to the limited that is locked in the gameplay. I focus because it's easier a lot on the deck composition, maybe drafting structure, and there is definitely plenty of knowledge to be there, to be had there, but it's not everything, because we still have to play the bloody game. And I pride myself in building decent decks and being a good deck constructor, but I do know that playing is my weakness, so that's the thing that I'm focusing on in terms of practice. But I do know that I lose win percentage because of mistakes that I make. Yesterday I punted the game away because I made the wrong order of triggers or something. And that will happen. And it's not that I misclicked or something. I just mentally didn't figure out that I could trigger them slightly differently so that I can win the game. Or I reanimate or recurred wrong creatures to my hand and lost the game because of that. Because I thought I didn't think that I can cast 2 spells in 1 turn and remove Knight, for example, which would have won me the game in the long run. So it's super easy to make mistakes, and the data as it exists right now is not allowing you to answer very well where the mistakes may lie and what are the play patterns. And I think that hopefully the replay data will return to be properly analyzed, and then we can dig a bit deeper into play patterns and try to figure out how to recognize good play patterns from bad play patterns, what is the successful play pattern, which play patterns are not successful and should be avoided, and so on. But for now, I just want to leave you that even if you analyze multiple factors, you might not find anything interesting about the card. Maybe because there is nothing interesting, but maybe it's because what is interesting is not in the deck builds, but in the play patterns. And with that, I would like to thank the 17 Lands team. As always, Viral Misnomer, Hululu, and Grant Wu, people that are most active on Twitter, apart from being, the pillars of 17 Lands. I would like to thank Fake Jake Brown, who is helping me to put it out as a podcast. And I would like to thank, for the ones of you that listen to the podcast version of it, I would like to thank SSQ and Mana Junkie for the theme song that I'm using as my intro and outro. And with that, see you next week.